So far, I've only talked about games with creation features, but what about a game that focuses primarily on creation? Well, Space Engineers is one of those games. A game where you can build all kinds of spaceships and space stations in outer space, while also being able to travel between planets and construct land vehicles on them, as well as planetary bases. A lot of people would consider Space Engineers to be a Minecraft clone, or just Minecraft in space. But there is a lot more to Space Engineers than merely being a Minecraft clone, as while it does have a similar idea and concept, I find Space Engineers to be so much more than that. The question is, how does Space Engineers measure up as a creative outlet? In terms of ease of use, Space Engineers is kind of a mixed bag. While it appears to be very simplistic on the surface with its mostly intuitive control scheme, there is a lot of complexity involved, hence the engineers in the name. You're not just shoving random parts together, you actually have to make it function by combining multiple components and fitting them inside a shell of armour. If you're making a station, most of this won't apply, as stations are completely static, incapable of movement, but they will still need a power supply to make all of the functional blocks work. Functional blocks will also require connectors to share inventories with one another, and everything must interconnect with one another for the best results. Some blocks won't even function without a conveyor system in place. All of this applies to ships as well. However, ships have yet another thing to be mindful of, and that's movement. Ships require thrusters to be movable, and you will have to place enough thrusters on each side for maximum stopping power. That means you will also need to place thrusters on the front of the ship to slow down, and if you don't have enough, it will take a long time to drop your speed to zero. Ships also have to turn, and to do this they need gyroscopes. The more gyroscopes in place, the more turning power a ship has. Too many gyroscopes may give the ship too much turning power, so it needs to be tuned correctly for the ideal effect. When Space Engineers first released in early access, it was a lot less complicated to make a spaceship, as they would all use ion thrusters, which only required power, a cockpit, a gyroscope, and thrusters on each side. But now it's not that simple, as you now have planets to deal with. Planets have gravity, which pull anything nearby towards them, and if you get too close with an ion ship, then you are guaranteed to crash land, and if you're playing survival, you'll probably die as well. For this reason, the developers implemented a hydrogen system using hydrogen thrusters, which requires hydrogen to operate. On top of this, you also need to connect conveyors to hydrogen tanks to give the thrusters power, or they won't work. You will also need to connect hydrogen tanks to an oxygen and hydrogen generator to fill the tanks with hydrogen. If none of this sounds complicated enough for you, the developers have also implemented a programmable block, which lets you input your own code into the game to make custom scripts. With all of this in mind, I will have to give this category a D rating because it's pretty overwhelming to learn how things work at first, though thankfully the building controls are mostly intuitive, to the point that you can at least build something. It goes without saying that Space Engineers has all the features you could possibly ask for in a space building game. With its focus on engineering, Space Engineers presents itself more as a simulation rather than a straight up building game, and with that in mind, there are a lot of features built around that. That being said, however, Space Engineers isn't completely devoid of science fiction features, as it features the likes of artificial mass and gravity generators. Over time, the game has become a lot more open towards science fiction, though it hasn't entirely dropped the realism elements, making for a very balanced creative experience. There are a ton of functional blocks that can allow you to do all sorts of crazy contraptions. While the selection of blocks in the game's early access was rather small, the full release has added a considerable amount of both building blocks and functional blocks. As fun as it is to make space stations and ships with the most basic functionality, those looking to take their creativity to the next level will be able to make use of rotors, hinges, decoys, artificial mass, merge blocks, pistons, timer blocks, sensors, and even programmable blocks. The only downside in the features department is the noticeable lack of decorative interior blocks, and while the game's paid DLC does rectify this, there isn't all that much of it in the main game. While this isn't necessarily a huge issue, it is something to bear in mind should you wish to give this game a shot. Despite this though, I will definitely give this category an S rating, as there's so much to tinker with in this game that you'll never be bored. So long as you have the burning desire to create, Space Engineers will accommodate you well in this department. With such a feature-rich game, it's expected that there is a wide variety of blocks to mess around with. In regards to building blocks, there are all kinds of shapes for you to experiment with to bring your ideal aesthetic to life, ranging from corners, slopes, and even half blocks. It can be pretty overwhelming to keep up with them all, but if you can find a way to utilise them, you can make some truly fantastic looking creations. There's a pretty nice assortment of functional blocks as well. Some have alternate aesthetics to them, which helps to make your creations look more distinguishable in terms of aesthetic design. Those looking for a lot of interior decoration may be disappointed in this regard, as while the paid DLC does improve things, I still find the amount of decorative blocks to be limited. Thankfully, the developers are continuing to release more content and the DLC isn't stupidly expensive, so it is possible that the game could improve in this category. Ultimately, where flexibility is concerned, I would have to give it an A, as there is still a lot of room for improvement, but there's still a decent assortment of blocks nonetheless. Space Engineers may quite possibly be the most aesthetically pleasing space building sandbox game ever made. The spaceships and space stations look fantastic, even on lower settings. The planets look nice enough, and creations blend in shockingly well with them. The DLC even adds skins that allow you to change the textures of the blocks to better fit their location, which makes things look even better. While it may not be the most visually spectacular game out there, it is definitely the best looking game of its kind without a doubt, so for this I will give the game an S rating. With all the creation features available to you, it would surely be a waste for them to be completely unused. This is where survival mode comes into play. With the projector block, you are able to place any of your creations into survival mode for you to build. So long as you have enough materials, that is. Survival in Space Engineers pretty much comes down to preventing energy depletion in space, as well as producing enough oxygen to breathe. There are a few other features like meteor showers, space pirates to fight, as well as some enemy AI to fight on planets, but none of it feels all that fleshed out. Put simply, you don't play this game for the gameplay, because it's pretty bare bones. The gameplay is merely an excuse to create stuff, and if you have a creative itch, then it should be enough for you. But honestly, I would have to give this an E rating. Having played Survival before, I can safely say that while it does prove mildly entertaining for a while, it can get pretty tedious at times, and eventually you reach a point where you are no longer surviving, and are pretty much just finding a reason to keep building. I'd rather just play creative mode honestly, because having to weld each and every block just gets tiresome after a while. While there are ways to make systems to somewhat automate it, it is still time consuming to gather the materials to make that stuff. I would much rather just build stuff in creative and admire my hard work than actually play the game, hence the E rating in the functionality category, as while the game does have things to do in it, I feel that the implementation of the actual gameplay is rather janky and basic to the point that it doesn't really feel good to play. I mean, it's better than nothing for sure, but I'd rather just build stuff to be honest. There are no limitations in Space Engineers. If your computer can handle it, you can do it. All you need to do is enable experimental mode, and you can create massive space stations or spaceships with multiple planets to accompany them. I don't recommend doing this though unless you have a very powerful PC that can handle a large capacity of blocks and planets in the world. Regardless, this category gets an easy S rating. So as you can see, Space Engineers isn't really much of a game. Rather, it's a creative outlet that offers many possibilities. If you look at it from that perspective, there's a lot of fun to be had with Space Engineers, but you need to be a creative person to have fun with it. It can also help to play with friends in multiplayer to make things a bit more interesting. You kinda have to accept Space Engineers for what it is, as if you treat it like any other game, you're just not going to enjoy it. Having followed Space Engineers since the early access alpha, I can safely say that the game has come a long way despite the many rough patches I went through during the game's development, such as corrupted saves, turrets destroying everything due to being implemented prior to factions being added, and many other annoying issues of the like. But despite all of that, I still kept coming back for more. In its current state right now, I can't say that the game is perfect, but it is so much better than it once was, and I can definitely recommend it, so long as they don't screw things up with another update.